Nigeria's financial blueprint for 2025 is now official. President Bola Tinubu last Friday signed the 2025 budgetary appropriation bill into law, outlining how the government plans to allocate a record-breaking 54.99 trillion naira. What can Nigerians expect from this budget, and will it be enough to drive meaningful growth? Well, we have joining us in the studio. Well, let's say it's rather lost but found, or Mr. Dr. Keneddy Iwundu. You've been missing in action. I don't know. Well, we found you right now. Well, how is it going? I mean, it's been a
Thank you.
while that we've had you on the program.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Okay, beautiful. I believe the ongoing conversation about the 2025 budget is, well, still ongoing as you know, the president signed the budget. But what is worthy of note is the fact that it was actually 49, around 49 trillion naira. It has been increased to somehow to 54.9 trillion naira, and which is as a result of possible revenues that would likely come from the FIRS and the customs. Well, Ms. Dr. Keneddy, what's your take on this? How credible are these revenue projections?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. As you said, the revenue projection was initially 49.7 trillion, and it went up to about 54.9 trillion, an additional of about 5.2 trillion, because the federal government is projecting that they will get at least 1.4 trillion additionally from Federal Revenue Service. They will get 1.2 trillion from the Nigerian customs. They will also get about 1.8 trillion from other government agencies. This is the projection because FIRS surpassed their revenue target for 2024. FIRS was given a revenue target of about 19.4 trillion, and they got 21.6 trillion. So the federal government believe that, yeah, FIRS can give us more money, customs can give us more money, other revenue agencies can give us more money. So as a result, let's take up this budget up. And that budget we have today is almost twice of what we have last year, because last year we had a budget of about 27 trillion and today we're having 54. So approximately 100% increase from what we have last year. One good thing about the budget is that it reduced our GDP deficit to GDP ratio. Prior to this budget, we've been complaining that the federal government has not been abiding to Fiscal Responsibility Act that says that GDP ratio, deficit to GDP ratio should not be more than 3%. So for the first time, we are seeing a GDP ratio coming to 1.52%, lower than that ceiling of 3%. That's very laudable. So I will commend federal government to have obeyed that Fiscal Responsibility Act, making sure that the deficit to GDP didn't cross 3%. So that's number one. Then number two is that the budget also have the lion's share given to the security. Presently, we have a lot of insecurity in the country. So the lion's share is given to security, then infrastructure, education, and health. And that is how it's supposed to be. And other things plays into it.
Okay, now you talked about the deficit. Deficit, we are talking about around 13 trillion, or is it 14.317 trillion? Budget deficit is quite huge. What are the risks, and how will this impact our financial stability?
Yeah, the deficit, of course, the federal government said that the deficit of about 13 trillion will be funded through borrowing, taking loans, through government bonds and all that. However, no document is perfect. The budget is not a perfect document. Introspectively, if you have asked me to join in the budget making, I would have suggested that the federal government, when you have identified there's more revenue of about 5.3 trillion coming up, what would have done is to leave the budget at that 49.7 trillion. And when additional revenue comes, it reduces the deficit from 13 trillion downwards to like 8 trillion. Because by the time you remove 5 trillion, which is additional revenue from the 13 trillion, your deficit would have come down to like 8 trillion. But what the federal government did was they maintained the deficit and still increased the budget. So we believe that they would have been more conservative in nature, where when you have identified more revenue that shoot up 49.7 trillion to 54.9, instead of increasing the revenue, you would have used that additional revenue to reduce the deficit. So that is what I feel that would have done on the part of the deficit.
So if Nigeria were to have better or good credit rating, don't you think this, wouldn't it be a different picture? Because we are talking about 54.9 trillion. This is somehow, when you compare it to other developing countries, it's actually small for Nigeria, for a country with the size of Nigeria.
Yeah, because we are looking at our debt financing. The federal government pegged debt financing at 14.3 trillion. And you know that debt financing has been one of the major challenges we are having in our budget. Because if you try as much as possible to be pragmatic to reduce borrowing, of course, your debt financing will also be reduced. So we are looking at what can government do differently to reduce our debt financing. And the only way to reduce the debt financing is to make sure that you reduce borrowing. You can't be borrowing and not expecting more debt financing. So what my advice is that if federal government identify more revenue coming up, so if jacking up the budget, you can use that more revenue that you have anticipated to reduce your deficit financing. And that will help us in financing our debt.
Okay, by the time we finally now get the tax reform bills in play, what do you think will, how will it help in the implementation of this particular budget?
Yeah, the tax reform bills will definitely help to increase the revenue generation, because in the new tax reform bill, the federal government is trying to have a Nigeria Revenue Service, where you have one agency collecting all the money, the funds, customs, all the revenue generating agencies. That will block loopholes and reduce leakages. Of course, that will enhance revenue collection to the government. But again, beyond that, I want to say that there's need for us to have proper budget monitoring and control. That is where National Assembly will come in. Because it's not enough having a budget where there is no proper monitoring and control. So the National Assembly has to exercise their oversight function to ensure that this budget is properly monitored and controlled. Then, another thing I want to put in there is implementation. We expected by now that the federal government is supposed to have released 2024 budget implementation. Let us know how much the previous budget has been implemented. Has it been implemented up to 50%? Or 60% or 70%. So that will help us to know how we're going to go into the new budget. For example, if budget 2024 implementation report is out, and let's assume that it has been implemented up to 60%, what would I do now is that, okay, what is the remaining 40% project that are left undone, and we have to bring it into 2025 and now make up. But we have a situation where we hardly see this previous budget implementation, which is part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So we expect to be seeing previous budget implementation, and that will help us drive a current. Just like we have had this budget now, 2025 budget, having about 54.9 trillion. By this time next year, we're supposed to have an implementation of this budget. To what extent was this budget implemented? Was it implemented to 50%? Was 60%? Is it 70%? It will give us a guide for proper implementation of the future budget.
Okay, is this the size of budget we should be having when you talk about achieving the $1 trillion economy?
Yeah, this is the kind of budget we should have, because one of the major challenges Nigeria have is generating the revenue. I said it last time here that Nigeria's budget is too small compared to other budgets of other countries. South African budget is still bigger than our budget.
Of course.
Egyptian budget is still bigger than our budget. So Nigeria,
that was what I said earlier.
Exactly.
we are celebrating a huge...
exactly.
But compared to other African countries,
exactly.
or emerging economies, actually ours
exactly.
is,
I was in Houston, Texas. The budget of Houston is just a city in Texas, not the budget of Texas. The budget of Houston alone was bigger than the budget of Nigeria. It's bigger than the budget of Nigeria. Houston is just a small city in Texas, a big city in Texas. The budget of that city is bigger than the budget of Nigeria.
How did we get to that position?
I think government is putting in place a revenue generation strategy that will increase our revenue, like what is doing in tax reform bill, by having a national revenue service. Because the government believes there's loopholes from all these agencies of government that are generating funds. But by the time you have one national revenue, Nigerian revenue service, generating all revenue, it will block those loopholes and also increase revenue, and also employ technology in the revenue generation.
Okay, talking about blocking new holes, how do we ensure that this allocation goes to the different sectors and they are properly used, not mismanaged?
Yeah, that's why we have National Assembly playing the role in terms of oversight. National Assembly, they have committees, both in the House of Reps and in the Senate. That's why I have Senate Committee on Defense, House Committee on Defense, Senate Committee on Education, House Committee on Education. So we expect these committees to follow up these ministries to ensure that these budgets, the funds allocated to this ministry are properly used. And if there is any form of infraction, there should be punishment. So that's why I'm saying that it's not only the federal government, not only the presidency or the executive that should be held responsible when it comes to budget implementation. The National Assembly has a primary role of oversight to ensure that this budget is properly implemented. And if they are not playing their part, of course, I don't think we are going to achieve what we have in mind.
Okay, what stands out for you in this 2025 budget, and which particular sector do you think we should focus more so that we can get the desired revenues for development?
Yeah, the sector I didn't see in this budget, possibly because the sector was a little bit privatized or deregulated, and so is the power sector. The power sector is the engine of growth. Nigeria needs to get to a level where you have uninterrupted power supply. If we don't have that, it's difficult to grow this country. So many countries, even in Africa, has achieved that level of having uninterrupted power supply. Whatever production, whatever thing you are doing in the country, Nigeria has an energy crisis. And if you don't solve that energy crisis, it's difficult. Even attracting foreign investors will be, most foreign investors don't want to come into production in Nigeria because of the power sector, because of the energy crisis. So I know we are talking about infrastructure, we are talking about security, which is good, we are talking about education, we are talking about health. We need to focus on the power sector. If we don't get the power sector working, it will be difficult for us to drive growth in the country.
Dr. Keneddy Iwundu, in fact, it's a pleasure having you back again, because you just, it's a pleasure having you back.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, beautiful.